We're going to aim to wrap up on time, so we have about 35 minutes for the panel. And the way I'd like to sort of try to approach this is to, on one hand, have a lively discussion here, and but approach the conversation along a couple of dimensions. So we get the time dimension we're going to look at here, the near futures, let's say 5 years, and then 20 years out. We're going to look at also at different technologies. We're going to consider the business angle, and ultimately we're going to consider the sort of the impact to end users, whether those are consumers and or businesses. We have a diverse perspectives here. You know, Kalyan, the academic entrepreneur, and Ben, the venture investor. We've heard from Dave from the BP, the oil and gas, and we have a new face in the crowd, Tor Jakob Ramsøy, CEO of Arundo, and fellow Scandinavian. I'm glad the Olympics are over. I can stop seeing Norwegians on the podium. I'm from Sweden, by the way, so.
So you have to know the most important for Norwegians is not to win the Olympics, but to beat the Swedes.
Yes, yes. And there was there was a great silver medal by the Norwegians in the men's biathlon relay. And Sweden, of course, got the gold, so that felt good.
For us Canadians, it's hockey, heavy sigh.
Right. And so, but the final perspective is you, right? So we're going to have active participation here. And so if you have a burning question that relates to what we're talking about, raise your hand, and I'm going to throw you the catch box. So maybe I was thinking where we can start is perhaps a basic question. And I've heard a number of different answers to this, and we've touched on it, but it's around digitalization, digital energy. What does it really mean? What is it, and what does it allow us to do? And perhaps, you know, Dave, you can sort of summarize what it is in a nutshell.
Damn. Well, I think maybe a simplistic way of looking at its impact to us. As I said, we kind of have this notion of digitization in pockets in a company, but we've never been really exploring our operations significantly. We've been acquiring data and we've been running operations in traditional sense. But let's extrapolate what we heard about the data collection process. Let's extrapolate what we heard about the AI routines and the cognitive. And let's presuppose then that we could actually have AI routines that could ingest all that data. And this is something we call the digital twin. So every aspect of our physical facility, all captured digitally in real time, in near time, whatever. So imagine what could happen if you have all of that data and then you can run it through simulated routines. Heavy processing, which is one of the reasons why we're interested in quantum. So in terms then of a possibility is we could actually operate in the future. I could collect all that data. I could be running simulations that project anywhere from 30 seconds in the future to 25 years in the future, right down to my subsurface things. And I could make a conscious decision, including economic factors, and I could make a conscious decision then of how to turn that valve. That's a radically different thing than a first principle approach. I was just worried about a pressure change. And that, I think, is something we haven't yet really understood. Is that a possibility? We think the trajectories are there, but I think that is one dramatic change to what we could see.
Right. Anyone else want to take a stab at that? Kalyan, you looked like you wanted to say something. Okay. So at some level, it sounds like you've been dabbling in a couple of approaches, but now the way you're describing it allows you to perhaps abstract and understand at a higher level what digital allows you to do. And perhaps one question for Arundo here. So we've heard sort of the corporate perspective, but the startup perspective, as you're starting to work with these big operations, these big companies, what are you seeing as a startup and where their strengths and their weaknesses are when it comes to digital operations?
So actually also following up a little bit what you said, David, I think it's a big paradox, at least in the oil and gas industry, because you invented big data 30 years ago. I think you mentioned it also. You had more seismic model, you had more GPU, you had more storage than any industry in the world, but you've probably been the slowest one to adapt into what's happening now with IoT, cloud computing. That was dangerous and scary, but now we are all into it. So I think what we see as a startup is you're still setting the pace. I think it's still going a little bit slow, but everyone is focusing on how this is hitting the large operators like the Shell and the Exxons and the BPs of the world. But just think about when BP is putting an oil line, a platform, new oil platform offshore, they may have 3,000 sub-vendors. Those are going to be hit so much harder because you control the resources, you will need energy if it's wind or oil or how it's produced, that's going to shift, but that's a different dialogue. But the whole vendor market is going to be hit much, much harder actually. And currently the focus is very much around what BP and the Shells is doing. But if I'm a pump manufacturer, no one wants to buy a pump, or you don't want to buy a pump, you want to buy pumping. So they are really going to be hit by the digitalization much harder than anyone else. So what we see, it's a big opportunity, and we just started to exploring into it. We just realized they will go slow. They're moving with glacier speed, and they're deciding because they have these multi-billion budgets, and the oil price is back on 70, and it's good time again. But if I'm a mid-sized pump manufacturer, they don't want to buy the pump. They want to buy the pumping. It needs to have a digital operating system. That's what we see is very, very interesting, how that's going to happen. And then what I would like to engage in a dialogue with you on, David, is how could we make that smarter together? Because if you're a mid-size, so GE, they spent 4.9 billion to develop Predix. Some people is still questioning how it's working. But 4.9 billion, if I'm a mid-size pump manufacturer, I can't spend 4.9 billion to build a digital operating system.
Ben, do you want to have anything to say?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'll add is
You spend more?
no, no. I think digital energy and providing digital solutions is two parts. There's the data piece, and there's more data becoming available, and that's incredibly valuable. But it's only incredibly valuable if you can distill it down. And I think there's a lot of effort out there to turn data into insights, because that's what customers really care about. They don't care about, whether you're sampling their pump at, once every day or once every second. It's really, how does that help me improve my operations? And so delivering digital technologies through again, I go back to business models that are really providing insights and value to customers is really what's going to continue to drive value there.
Yeah, if you want to add something.
No, So my work is actually to turn data into insights or predictive models, and I actually 13 years ago I started at GE as an intern, and I think from that perspective, and when we try to build these models that either derive insights from the data, or we try to build something that's predictive and try to use that, I think one of the things that we are finding is a lot of that work has been traditionally approached, both in academia and in industry, as a sort of what we call discovery-first paradigm. So when we have data, we don't even know whether it can predict something. So we try to make that as the first goal. Can we test that? Can we see if it works? And that's what we do, what we call a discovery paradigm. And then we write a paper or a blog post, and the industry has now adopted that they write blog posts about it. But 99% of those things are not actually getting deployed for several reasons. First is many a times it's not closely, those things are not designed by keeping the end user in mind. So they're not being developed to actually deploy, so they're not actually, they're making cool discoveries, but we don't actually know if that's actually a useful discovery that the end user wants. Simple things like, do we predict something 4 weeks ahead or 2 weeks ahead? That makes a huge difference business-wise. Doesn't make a huge difference discovery-wise. As long as we are able to predict, we are okay with it. We can claim that we made a prediction using the data. So I think we are finding a lot of those challenges in terms of when we take something to practice. Machine learning or AI solutions that are built on the data, we discover something and we take them to practice. That translation has not been easy.
Mm-hmm. I think if we could follow up on what you said, that's a little bit what we saw as the biggest problem. We see a lot of great data science who's dying in PowerPoint. So it's not that people are able to make smart models, but how do you deploy it? How do you get to work? That's actually one challenge. The second challenge is how do you change someone who's a maintenance engineer who's been operating on the same SOPs for the last 20 years? That's probably one of the biggest obstacles you have, because if you deliver machine learning in a black box, why should I trust it? I don't even understand what's going in. I don't understand even less what's happening in that black box. And the only thing going to happen is you would have an autonomous production in the future. So I'm just going to go away. So I'm very sympathetic to the challenges you have to digital transform, but very interested to hear what you're saying about that.
One of the things that has come up from a lot of angles is access to data, right? And we talked about it, everyone's mentioned it, but what about data ownership, and especially when you start dealing with the subcontractors, the number of subcontractors that you have, and as you start working with in academics and startups, how is that changing? Is your view and sort of your sense of the value of that data changing, and your willingness to share it?
Yeah, I think it needs to change. To follow on what Tor is saying, I think there's quite a disruption going on right now in kind of the surface umbrella around the energy core. In your example of the pump manufacturer is just that. We're seeing that in the inspection community. We're seeing the contracts. If you actually examine the data flow, we usually only get insights from these people, because that's the way we contracted. We only wanted the answer. Now, because we're able to use these kinds of new routines, we actually don't know what data is going to be useful. So I think for the next few years, our real challenge is that we want everything. We don't know yet what to, quote, throw away, because we don't yet know if an AI routine will find something valuable about that piece of data. So there's two things. One is about access now to some of the raw sensor data that we didn't ask for in the past or were considering. And we need to now have access to that. And then we have to take a look at our ability to work with new data sources from new sensor types. So I think we're going to find some intriguing new insights as to what's going to give us a better prediction. And I think it's going to be new sensor types. I think we are only exploring on what we know of the current ones. So we're working with thermal and IR, and we're working with visual a lot, but we're still not doing a lot in hyperspectral or other parts of the spectrum, or acoustics, or any of those places, which is all, I think, valuable data about what we're doing. I think just one other direction that to go back to your original question was that we haven't yet talked about what do we see as new business models. So I like what you were saying, because we're exploring in these disruptions, which occur to us as well, the electrification and EVs, what does that do to our energy models, and then what does it create for us for new ones? So I spoke about what we see 5 years from now in the space of our traditional or normal kind of operations, but there's this whole branch of what else could we be doing that's in energy, but in digital energy in a different way than just a liquid hydrocarbon.
So if we think about the challenges of data, of making that valuable and successful and useful within an enterprise, what are some of the, if you had to name just 3 keywords, sort of the key challenges or the key requirements for success, what would those be? And I'm going to start with Kalyan over there. And you got to stay
Very nice to hear their perspective.
Let's see.
I think one of the big challenges that when I work with enterprises is the sort of a shift in mentality. They have to shift now from investing a lot of into research and discovery, than actually saying that let's figure out what the end use cases and business cases and go deployment first. We have enough technology in machine learning. We have enough to actually address the needs of the industry for what data they have. We don't have to innovate, huge amounts of new machine learning algorithms and machine learning models right now. So that's the first thing that I find very interesting, is that companies are investing millions and millions of dollars in R&D efforts, but going for actual, when it comes to implementing a machine learning solution for business value, they're going to startups, or they're going to outside vendors, or they're going to the universities, and they're coming to the consultants, which I feel is just very, it's completely, that needs to shift. the hype actually is like, I mean, numerous times I get asked to talk about what is hyped up versus to talk about that they have a data store. So they have a classic way that I get approached is that we have this data source and nobody is making a use of it, and it's just lying there. We need to make it valuable. And I turn around and I say, okay, let's make it valuable. So let's do it. Oh, can you tell us about deep neural networks? I'm like, no, that doesn't. There is no that doesn't apply to your data. Just by the way, just so you know. So I think that's one of the big challenges for enterprises is to overcome the hype, realize that there is already technology that can be put to use, target your resources directly to address that. So I think that's my.
Let's go to Ben.
You asked for three words.
Two, yeah. 1, 2, 3.
I sort of go to fundamentals. I mean, you've got to understand that the data is valid, right? It's correct data. If you're not analyzing correct data or accurate data, then you're wasting your time. And then I think it's getting down to useful data sets, understanding what is valuable data, doing the work to figure out if a certain data set is valuable. If it's not, lots of them aren't, then move on to the useful ones. And then I think it's not necessarily a determiner of success, but I think there is this open versus proprietary data sets, and where you make the decision to keep it proprietary, where you make the decision to open it up on an anonymized basis for sort of the broader benefit of the ecosystem and the analytics, and where you just open it up completely and allow people to see it.
I very much agree in the two you said, Karen, that it's not about having the latest deep learning. It's just that deep learning doesn't fit for everything. It's very good to identify cats and dogs and stuff like that, but probably not to fix your problems. But the data science exists. That's not the challenge. It's why we chose oil and gas first is because it's super sophisticated, instrumented. Even a 25-year-old oil rig has 25,000 tags. The problem is actually the only thing that they get access to is less than 5%, because you never know where the data is ending. It's ending in some kind of a black box, and no one has realized this has value. So if you, when you are doing your models, if you could get access to that, you have a big advantage to the other ones. So I think then my third one is probably, we shouldn't underestimate what I was trying to address, a little bit the human nature and the resistance of change and who is operating in asset-heavy industries. And we're also hearing a lot you using regulators as an excuse to make the change, but literally it could be a facilitator. If you talk to the regulators, they just want to make sure it's safe. And if you could document it's even safer by doing this, it's no problem.
Yeah. Dave, anything to add? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll kind of
just keywords.
Trusted insight.
Trusted insight. Meaning.
And so it's less about the data, it's about understanding what insight is given from data. So it's not about always collecting more data, because that just may not do anything to the signal-noise ratio. That just may be collecting more data. So it's kind of understanding a bit. I think, Tori, you used this language a little bit. You have to understand a bit more about how those algorithms are handling that kind of data, which data makes sense. So I have a bit more of a directed data acquisition process. So, and then I trust the insights out. So again, it's to say if it states this is the kind of anomaly and it only has 6 months to go, you want to trust it there. The other word I'll use is cognition. So a little bit contrary to what the guys are saying here, our job is to look that much further in the future, 5, 10 years out. So I agree with what you guys are all saying about what can we do here and now, but we're also trying to say 5 years from now, will I have cognition capabilities to add to the trusted insight?
We already have the cognition capabilities.
Well, that depends on your view.
We can actually build systems that do
But you said I didn't need to build
you just
any more.
Have to give us access, you just have to give us access to the data and
you
not
said I didn't
distract
have to
us.
build anymore. You see?
So let's take a poll here from the audience and see what keywords here resonate with people. So I think we had sort of clean, valid, useful data. Is that a challenge that people are seeing? And you don't have to just pick one of the ones I'm going to mention. Just raise your hand. Dealing with that, absolutely over there. What about the sort of the mentality and the human culture in terms of implementing a digital strategy, making value out of that? Yeah, a couple of hands. Yeah, all around. Trusted insight. So it's not about more data, but making sense of it, I guess. Yeah. Right. Cognition versus we have it. We already have or access to data, I guess, right? So those are the two challenges. All right. No one got that. Something that a lot of startups wonder about is, how to work effectively with the bigger companies, right? It's a question I asked the startups. Tell me what you want to, what kind of questions you want to ask, and so they always ask, how do I work effectively with a big corporation? Because especially in this industry, you're different in clock cycles. 5 to 10 years for you. A startup is maybe 5 to 10 months or 5 to 10 weeks. Any advice on that front in terms of what you've seen work really well? And I want to hear from Ben as well as Dave. Maybe Ben, you start out.
Sure. It's hard. Big companies are tough. They're big. They're slow. They're risk averse. It just, in comparison to a lean startup that's 6 people trying to build a business, it's just, we operate at different scales and different speeds. That's partly what we're at GE to do, is to serve as that conduit between startups and the industrial businesses within GE. We serve as sort of a constant reminder to our business units that there's a different pace operating out there in terms of innovation, and they need to start working towards that. And we've got certain individuals within our business units that are dedicated to working with early stage companies, and they understand that, and it's improving that process. The other thing that always gets a big company's attention is customers and revenue. If you can come in with a customer or a revenue generating opportunity that you can work with a company on, that always gets the ball rolling faster versus saying, hey, you have a technology, we have a technology, this is how we think they could work together. What's the outcome? What's the customer outcome?
Traction, right?
Yep.
So, but I'd like to just push back a little bit, and I often see, so I work with a lot of startups here at MIT, and they'll have traction, and they'll have a great technology, and sometimes it just feels like the big company is not able to. They don't even have a process internally to deal with startups, right? So they might have an innovation team, and that gets them through the pilot, but then there's nothing happening after that. There's no plan beyond that. And so I'm just curious, like, what advice would you have for those kind of corporations?
For the large corporations?
Yeah, like how do they improve that profit?
You have to invest in it. You have to invest in working with early stage companies. It's not. It is a two-way street. It's not like there's a map to work with a big organization. There has to be another corresponding map on the other side that says, how do I work with an early stage company? And I think we've developed that at GE, and I'll be honest, there are business units that are better at it than others, and there's some that are coming up the learning curve. So we definitely push that forward as an innovation organization within GE and an external facing organization to really help drive that. I think having programs that engage with startups, we call them demo days, but bring in a bunch of companies to our business leaders. They're all in the room at the same time. It would be an event a lot like this with just GE folks in the room to get them exposure to entrepreneurs and innovators, and then there's follow-ups that come from that. We sort of try to immerse it as much as we can in the culture of the business units.
Yeah. Dave, anything you want to add?
Well, I certainly agree with Ben. I think it's a real challenge for companies like ours to do it. I think we've retackled some of that. Sean over there is part of our ventures. So we've actually re-examined how we do ventures. We stopped it for a while, quite honestly. And I think we're re-examining under the light of digital innovation. We're getting more traction with them. I think one of the challenges we always have as a large company is, and I'll go back to our remit, which was scalable solutions. And your challenge is in some of the startups, what we can offer is subject matter expertise. Mm-hmm. What we can offer is an assessment to say, actually, this is market capable. We could see value out of it, we could start leverage value, we could start to consider what would be the actual business case of doing it. What we're not in a position of doing is saying, you're going to be our sole provider. We can't strike large contracts for you with you because you can't scale to our place. You have to be ready at a certain size in that startup to say we actually could adopt this across the board. So from the kind of the way our mission is now in our company, that's going to be probably one of the biggest things. We could find something quite good that says market technically is ready, but business-wide you're not ready to scale with us, therefore it's not ready. And I think that'll be a challenge.
I think that adding one more thing is you have to get stakeholders in the business units comfortable with the sort of risk profile of early stage companies and working with them. They're used to programs that are big programs that have a high rate of success versus us in venture. Most of the companies in the portfolio aren't successful, right? That's the nature of early stage innovation. And so getting people to understand that and accept that is key to initiating those engagements and then understanding that it's a long-term game.
Right. Just want to, let's take a question here.
I'd like to ask a question about when you can engage. So for example, I see a lot of activity around blockchain in this town.
Oh, I thought we were going to
and it seems to me that a lot of them don't really know what they're doing with it, right? They don't see the right application, but they're still building something with blockchain.
In this town.
In this town, but I'm sure it's the same everywhere else, right? But it could be very helpful for startup companies if GE or BP would come in and give them some advice, the domain expertise on the kinds of problems they see that they could imagine could be solved with a blockchain. So that would be before the demo day, but because there are 50 startups that are trying to do something, and if they got some guidance, would you be prepared to do that kind of thing? Or more generally, where do you see the right moment of engaging with startups?
Well, I'll give an answer to that right now. So we actually belong to a number of consortia, and that's the approach we're taking. As you say, there's a lot of experimentation going on in this space, a lot of use cases being derived, but rather than working with an individual startup, we're working through the consortia model because we think we can leverage all that because people are using different aspects of implementing blockchain or executing it. And we see some startups based on this technology in blockchain or that. And so we've chosen to kind of broaden it at this point in an experimentation phase. But I think it's what Ben was saying. At this point, because we believe there could be something quite significant there, but no one knows what it is yet, it is experimentation. This is a new model for us where we are investing time and effort and money to explore that and come out. So that's going back to what you were pointing out. It's not something BP would have done 5 years ago is what I'm suggesting to you. And I think we're now recognizing we need to do more of that. But in terms of specifically blockchain, we actually have quite a bit of activity going on in the experimentation phase.
And maybe I'll just answer your question as well from my perspective. So for ILP members, they can post these kinds of challenges or opportunities, we call them, on our website where they're looking for startups to solve specific use cases. And that's proving to be starting to show some good results, right? So it can work that way. What about renewables? I mean, so building on the decarbonization theme here, is digital different there? Is it less of a problem? These are, somewhat newer, less complicated devices, comparing an oil rig versus a wind turbine. Is it different, or is it?
It is different.
Yeah.
Because an oil field is maybe put in production 40 years ago, and you just made a new 40-year plan. So how do you make that digital? How do you create a digital twin versus that? And you have 25, 50,000 sensors, and you don't know how to get access to it. But a wind turbine, it's 15,000 or 1,500 sensors, and it's new. So it's easier and it's fewer parts who's integrated. So at least on what we are doing, but someone could probably say it's much more complicated on other stuff, but just the equipment part is easier.
Yeah, I agree on the equipment side. I'll say that with renewables, these are intermittent resources, and predicting those resources becomes a new challenge. Cloud coverage, wind profiles, et cetera. Solar is a solid state device. There's not a lot of moving parts there. Maybe a tracker, but a wind turbine is a slightly more complicated device, but nothing compared to a gas plant. But I think coordinating those assets, understanding when generation is going to be coming from one region, when it's coming from another, is a problem that can be solved with digital solutions and simulations and analytics.
Yeah. Yes, the whole ecosystem is much more complicated in renewable. So you can't only look on the equipment, you need to look on the grid, you need to look on the financial market. Are you going to have a forward or swap or whatever, and how should I bet, and what's my energy mix? So it's the whole integration, but the equipment part is much easier. But the ecosystem is much more complicated.
All right, let's go to the long term here, and so 20 years from now, let's say, and let's imagine a blank canvas and try to paint what the future will look like. And BP has the LTTV, long-term tech vision. Yeah. How do you even think about technology that far out? I mean, AI, is that going to be a thing then, or are we on to something else? And
well, at this point, we think it's AI and cognition. I'm sorry, I'm going to bring that word up. I don't for it, but I think we can't do it as just technology. It's not just the LTTV as we call it, but I would hope you guys look at our energy outlook, because that actually is one of the fundamental drivers of how we look and choose technology as well. And that was a new marriage we brought together. So we predict on where we think the energy sources are and that whole bit, and I think we're known for that. That's always on our bp.com website. And we use that a lot to inform us about these long-term technology views and say, actually, where is it better for our investment profile? So we are talking about peak oil, surprisingly. What is peak oil demand? Not peak oil supply. So we've said, actually, there's no such thing as peak oil supply yet from our view. There is peak oil demand. So we kind of are looking at the energy equation and say, where's energy going to be consumed? It's a lot of what Ben was talking about with the grid. What's electrification going to do to us? Where are we actually going to put hydrocarbon energy into play versus where are we going to put electrical produced by wind or solar into play, or biofuels? So we look at all of those to help us say, given the energy equations, where we think the balance is. That helps inform us on what technology do we think may help us for that.
But okay, so let me ask the question slightly different. Let's think about experiences that we're going to enable in the future, and so let's not be tied to technologies or predicting the future based on current data. Let's just try to picture something completely new and different. And so what does the experience in the future feel like, look like, smell like, or whatever? Who wants to go first?
No, I think you will not find a solution as only focusing on one installation or one set of equipment. I think the solution where we really could get leverage is a little bit what we talked about in the renewable, how you could think about the whole energy value chain and what your energy basket looks like, and where's the future demand, where's the future supply, and how would you match towards that. But I think it's also a challenge, how do you find a good balance between realizing a use case tomorrow or today versus only planning for the next 5 years. Oil companies are very good thinking 5, 10, 20 years.
All right.
I don't know if I have a good answer to the question, but I think one thing we'll have to think about as we plan 20 years out is infrastructure in general. You think about the sort of technology adoption cycles, and they're constantly compressing, but we're still building infrastructure that's 20-year, 30-year, 40-year life infrastructure. And I go back to mobility and think about a parking garage that might be built tomorrow, and they underwrite it with a whatever multi-decade life of a parking garage, and then all of a sudden technology catches up and there's no cars to park in that garage because we're using fewer cars and they're all autonomously driving around. I think that's a problem. We're going to have to think about how we flexibly design and build infrastructure to be able to adapt with the technology developments that are coming. I think on the energy side, you could picture a world that is just increasingly more and more getting closer to 100% renewable generation, and what that means for the world. That's it.
Kellyanne?
Cool. So you said 20 years from now,
Yeah,
what
20
can we
years.
imagine? I
Yeah.
think I think if you were to imagine, I think AI, I can speak from AI's perspective and maybe its intersection with energy, but it will become more programmable. So I think people will be able to build their own AI systems for their own purpose. Right now, it's very centralized. Enterprises trying to build AI systems to make predictions for people, but it's not people who are actually trying to use the data and build predictions for them. So I think that will start to happen, just how we can now on-demand ask a car, we can on-demand design a prediction problem that we are interested in, and we should be able to use the data to make that prediction for ourselves. And it may not be of interest to anyone else, but it's something that we want to predict ahead.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Yeah. Let's see here.
So I run a low-cost energy startup here in Cambridge, and my question is for the whole panel, but mostly for BP and GE. You guys are historically known as large capital-intensive projects, big safety, reliability, that kind of stuff. If the shift goes to distributed energy and we actually see that take place and sort of overcome the generation and sharing and economy, and it becomes sort of an Uber-like, capital-light endeavor, do you see a complete shift within your organizations from a actual physical product, which as a techie I like, to a completely sort of virtualization system in which you're going to monetize or capitalize or become a player in that?
Well, I think there will be a shift. So I'll say there will be quite a shift in terms of how much is the virtual energy placed. I think from a physical side, though, one of the models we've been looking at is should we go to more local refining? Remember, a lot of the reason we're the size we are is that old model of scale gives you low cost. And so could we possibly see from the energy shift our infrastructure being more localized and small refineries, even family-sized refineries in rural areas, for example, as opposed to urban? Is that a possibility? Those are things we're considering. Yeah.
Other questions?
Ben, did you?
Yeah, I'll just say, to answer that one real quick, for GE's perspective, I think it'll be an evolution. I think there will be certain technologies that we've got a differentiated solution that we'll continue to maintain, and then working with other best-in-class technologies to best optimize the network, I think will be the solution that prevails. But it will be an evolution and a shift from our business model now. Yeah.
If I, as a Norwegian and startup, could answer, 50% of all cars in Norway, new cars, are EVs or chargeable cars, so not 2%, 50%, and it literally happened immediately. I know because we've been working with one of the large majors, they are using Norway as the example. They expect it's not going to be sold any gas line in 10 years, literally nothing. So that's it's the future is here. It's probably not going to be an evolution. It's probably going to be a revolution.
Igor?
So as we talk about evolution of energy markets in general, I think it's important for us to talk about utilities and what role do you guys see them play as we go forward? Do you see them downscaling in their role? Do you see them taking on a more all-encompassing role? And in general, how do you see them interacting with the future market?
I think you're seeing different utilities do different things. They're definitely, their core business model is threatened by what's going on. You see a lot of the progressive utilities in Europe moving into behind-the-meter applications and getting more involved in the assets that are going in behind the meter. Look, the wires are never going to go away. We're never going to be in a world where we can install solar and a battery in one location and just run off of that. There's geographies where that doesn't work, and there's instances where people live and work that doesn't work. So the wires are never going to go away. There needs to be a system operator, and I think that's a role that utilities will continue to fill. But they are changing. The progressive ones are changing.
Okay, so I promised I'd try to end on time. We're just slightly over here. So I think we're going to call it a day for now. Before we thank the audience, I wanted to point out a few things. Just remind you of upcoming events we have. The ICT conference in mid-April, the flagship event mid-May, and then we'll be back here for AgTech in June. And beyond that, thanks so much for coming. There's going to be a survey going out probably next week, so please answer that and let us know how we can improve. Let's join me in thanking the panelists.